Welcome back to BCB Live, the safest station in the nation. Hey, Dave, we're joined by Tyler Cole, the Director of Carbon Intelligence at FreightWaves. Over 15 years of experience in global supply chain management as both a broker and a shipper. His work has spanned all modes of transportation across various sectors such as biofuels, food, beverage, bulk commodities, and CPG. A passion for eliminating waste and emissions for freight. Drive Safe Dave. That's why he went to FreightWaves. I've known my buddy Tyler for many years, and I knew Tyler first as a broker, and then as this guy that started talking about this carbon intelligence, or this carbon footprint. I'm like, dude, I don't know what any of this stuff means. Tyler, welcome to BCB Live.
Glad to be here, man, with Sir Rick and Driver Dave. You guys are doing awesome work.
Hey, thanks, Jay. Hey, so we're sitting here, and the last thing I looked at was carbon dating. That was about as far as I get. So I'm not even sure what. So can you just tell me what carbon footprint is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the best measurement you have of the emissions that are coming off your operation. It can rely on different data sources, but at the end of the day, everybody's trying to understand the impact of their activities. And these have been around for decades, man. This is not new science that we're uncovering here at FreightWaves, but what we're trying to do is make it more broadly available to an industry that really needs awareness about their impact today, because in my mind, there's a very big green wave coming, and small to medium enterprises, especially in freight and logistics, need to start understanding just some of the basics here.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because, it wasn't but a couple of years ago, not many of us knew anything about a pandemic, didn't know anything about viruses, but now we're all somewhat experts, right? I mean, we're all somewhat experts on how to deal with the pandemic, how to deal with viruses and all this other stuff. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get to an understanding of how to deal with this carbon intelligence.
Totally agree. I hope it doesn't come to the point where we're all locked down trying to figure this thing out. But you're right. It's very important, and it's going to be increasingly important as the business climate change. I'm not a climate alarmist. I didn't come to this position from an environmental point of view. It's really more of a business opportunity point of view for me. And the more that I've dug into the business opportunity, the more I am becoming alarmed about the impact on climate. But that's certainly not why I started down this road. So I think the industry is going to be brought along in the same way. It's going to start coming as you see additional requests from customers looking for more data, as you start to see potential regulations, probably starting in Europe and on the West Coast and slowly making their way to the rest of the world. It's just something people need to be aware of because it's coming.
Now, I was really kind of worried, making sure you wouldn't look down at me still for using my Arid Extra Dry, aerosol cans. Like, I just lost another, and I don't have many friends, and I thought for a second I may have lost you there. So, hey, bear with me as I fall into understand, and I'm being serious. So this part is getting to understand this carbon footprint. And so Tyler, how do you collect this data? I mean, we hear it in here, everything supposedly has some kind of carbon, and what does that mean? How do you collect that carbon data?
It's a lot of data, and it's coming from different places. So you just hug the laptop. So think about everything that goes into that laptop component. We all know how diverse and global and complex supply chain networks are. And we know that that little piece of plastic in front of you that's doing all the work here is made up of thousands of parts from thousands of suppliers all over the world. So to do a very robust and understand the carbon that's actually in and that made up getting that to you takes a lot of data from a lot of people. What sort of transport did they use to get the semiconductor from A to B? How many times did it cross the ocean? And each one of those has its own, you might call it default emissions factor or assumptions that go baked into that number. So there's a lot that gets put into it. When we talk about freight, though, we're talking about fuel at the end of the day. Unless you're running a bunch of facilities, right, and there's a big power load from your operation, we're talking about how you're getting stuff from A to B, what kind of equipment you're using, and what you're using to fuel it.
Gotcha. And when you hear it from the shippers, I mean, what are the shippers saying about this carbon footprint? Are they? Do you see anything right now with the shippers, say, going to the carriers and saying, you know what, you've got to step your game up to be able to pull our freight?
Definitely. You're starting to see it. And I remember when I was doing it, working with you guys, our biggest customers were asking, really, are you SmartWay certified? Do you understand what it is? Do you have a plan? But it wasn't anything that was impacting their procurement decisions. It wasn't taking that seriously. It's starting to get to that point. So you're seeing the questions get a little more complex. shippers are starting to ask questions about different fueling technologies, your ability to charge an NEV, your ability to provide dedicated service, or at least your ability to give them actual emissions data, which would mean sharing some form of fuel consumption with them. It's probably a small amount now, and it's starting with the larger multinational shippers, but it's going to cascade down through tiers of suppliers. And we all know that the trucks are running for both of those types of companies. So we shouldn't be surprised when you start to get more requests.
When we see that, we've actually seen a little bit of it. I don't know that we've seen it in the carbon footprint ideology, but there's customers that say absolutely no idling, right? We're not going to allow idling on property. We're not going to allow you to just sit and burn fuel. We're gonna try to minimize those emissions. I think those kinds of things, and I think one of the biggest ones is Walmart. I don't think Walmart allows it anymore on any idling on any property anywhere in the United States. But I think we're going to see more and more of that. Is that what you're basically saying in the ideology? Is this going to be legislative, or is this going to be business going to generate this idea forward?
I think businesses will be nimbler and move faster. I mean, Walmart's a great example there, and you start to see all these pledges coming out. There's a new one every week. Those are going to start to have an impact as people in the shipping community or the shipper community understand what are the levers I can pull to start hitting my targets. So I think business will have a more immediate impact. Can't ignore the fact that legislation might come on the back end, though. People need to be prepared. Fortunately, you usually have more time to prepare for that.
Yeah, and Tyler, you mentioned earlier about fuel, right? Fuel being the biggest component, probably the one that we're ready to tackle today. What are you seeing from the shippers in ways to combat this? And I'm going to give you an example. I would think as a shipper, and I think we see a little bit more. I don't know if they're thinking carbon on this, but you know what? At the end of the day, if you're a shipper and you raise your mile per gallon, that I'm going to pay fuel surcharge on 8 miles per gallon. Those carriers that are running 6.5, they're gonna try to bake it in their rate, but they may not get that freight because we're after a consistent fuel surcharge table that says, I'm gonna pay you at 8 miles a gallon, and those shippers that have the updated, Dave, the newer technology, the newer trucks, the fuel efficient trucks, we're gonna hit 8.2 miles per gallon anyway. It's those that aren't participating that are going to hit a struggle. And I think from a shipper, Tyler, I say that's one way they can start to force it, right, from their eyes. Are you seeing any other examples of that?
That's a great example, and that's one that's really touchy among the carrier community too, right? We understand the cyclicality and the pushback, right, of just that contentious bid relationship that I think is going away. I think we're moving into a point where procurement's going to look really different in 5 years than it does today. And emissions will be a big part of that. Because now you start thinking, if shippers really want to move the needle with their carriers, are you going to have a better chance at getting your carriers to tell you the MPG on every truck? Or are you going to be able to start measuring emissions instead of fuel and rewarding carriers for cutting what you really want, which is lower emissions? You obviously want lower costs and you want them to be more efficient, but they're going to go hand in hand. And I think it's more palatable for the carriers to be rewarded for reducing emissions than to be worried someone's going to claw your surcharge back.
I'm just curious, as we talk about, shipping and trucking and stuff like that, is it really possible in trucking to get to a net zero? I mean, in a truck, because you're sitting there, you're burning a fossil fuel, and I know eventually we're going to go to electric vehicles and stuff like that, but as it is right now, how good is a trucking company at a carbon footprint?
Not as good as the world's going to ask them to be in 10 years.
Yeah.
But you're right. There is a way to do it today. It's just not a fun way. It's to turn off the truck and leave it alone. And nobody wants to do that. We've got to balance moving goods for our customers safely and on time according to the way their customer wants. And that's what we've always done and what we always will do. We will not be a leader in this space as a freight. No one's going out and buying experimental fuels because you can't afford it and it's too risky. So it's going to come at scale and it's going to come slowly. We might only have a 10, 15% penetration rate from light and regional duty cycles of whatever it is, hydrogen, EV, alt fuel, biofuel around these regional hubs in 15 years. That might just be the road we're going towards.
And I'm going to go, there are ways today, it's an investment, right? And who's going to pay for the investment? That's the big question. But Drive Safe Dave, there are ways today that we in the trucking industry can have an immediate effect. One way would be to have APUs on every single truck. Dave, when we talk about APUs versus non-APU, what does that data say?
That data says that you're going to get a much higher miles per gallon.
But when you're idling, what happens? Idling on the APU versus idling without the APU.
Oh yeah, if you idle with an APU, you can get 10 hours on a gallon of fuel instead of 10 gallons.
Yeah. So every time you idle out there, Tyler, you're going to burn an hour of diesel. You're going to burn a gallon of diesel out there every time you idle, as opposed to an APU, you're going to burn a tenth of that. And so I think there are little ways. Again, that's a cost of what, $10,000, $12,000 for that APU.
Yep.
There's a cost associated to it. And I think, are we seeing the government come in to help these trucking companies say, you know what, we agree with you. We're going to give you some kind of rebate, some kind of incentive for having an APU on every one of those trucks running today.
You're seeing things like the STEER Act being introduced in Congress, which is an important piece of legislation that provides stipends for efficiency measures, technologies really on retrofits or aftermarket. Think aerodynamics, think things like APUs, although I don't know if APUs qualify for that act, but those are the sort of things that'll really move the needle. We all like to think it's a big grandiose change in the entire fuel system, but the reality is it's going to come incrementally in smaller bites, whether that's through driver behavior, technology that's being bolted onto the truck, routing optimization. There's lots of opportunities. What I'm really afraid of, Rick, and you and I have talked about this, is that as carriers make these changes, you have to be really good at reporting a baseline in order to get credit for what you're doing. And if you're not sharp today, just start with SmartWay. SmartWay is the easiest place you can start. They lay the tools out. It's a good building block. We can improve on it. That's what we're working on at FreightWaves. But if you don't have a good baseline, you're not going to get the reward you want for all these activities you're taking.
We see out there on the road today, we see the SmartWay technology with the skirting and the covers for the hubs and the undercarriage, the wings on the back of the truck. And we see all these, and they've become just a standard out there that we've come to understand and appreciate over time. And I look forward to what we're going to be doing as we go forward. But even skirts on trailers are an investment. Even skirts, that's really what we're talking about. It's not just the APUs, but we're talking about these investment dollars to be smarter. Low resistant tires. There would seem to be way more important now than grip hugging tires or traction tires. We want low resistant tires. So as a truck driver, in my mindset, I'm thinking that's not really what I want on the rubber when the rubber meets the road. Something that doesn't grip it very well. Their kind of mindset is different, and we've got to think of them new. And it's kind of a old meets new, but really my big question is, what do we see coming in the near future about these new SmartWay technology?
I think what you're going to expect is shippers are going to start first rewarding their core carriers who are taking some of these activities, and it might not be in the form of higher rates because the market's going to do what the market's going to do. It might be in the form of longer term contracts, preferential deals, opportunities for second looks at pieces of business. I think shippers will continue to do what they've always done, which is work with the guys they know and like in order to accomplish what their boss is telling them they got to get done. I hope we continue to see technologies scale and get cheaper and end up saving carriers money in the form of increased fuel economy. And then carriers can continue to make investments in places they need to, specifically on like digitizing the trip and sharing data with customers and competitors. So,
hey, Tyler, you brought up a great point. I wanted to make sure we touch on that. When do you think that the independent contractors, the carriers, when will we be forced or to start tracking some of these emissions?
You see something similar today in that there are carriers or there are customers that say, look, we're only going to do business with SmartWay people. We know in reality when that loads on the dock and needs to go, that sometimes that exception becomes part of their 1% exception.
You've been a broker before. You know how that works.
Can you make it?
For sure. So I think that will continue. Nobody's going to cut off their nose to spite their face until there's a hard cost associated with this emission. That might happen in Europe in the next 2 to 3 years. Road freight's going to be part of their cap and trade system in carbon by 2023 or 2024. So, let's just see how the market develops. In the meantime, carriers need to understand how to get their hands on the data and apply, fuel consumption with each load that goes through their system.
All right. Hey, Tyler, I want to thank you for being on BCB Live. Before we let you go, you've got to say this. Say your name and say BCB Live. the safest station in the nation?
Anything for you, Sir Rick and Driver Dave. Tyler Cole from FreightWaves. Happy to be on BCB Live, the safest station in the nation.
All right. Hey, Tyler, I want to thank you for that. For those of you that, you can catch Tyler on FreightWaves, let me tell you something. If there's somebody that knows about this emissions, about this carbon, it's Tyler. He's been involved in this, Dave. I remember talking to him. I'm telling you, I bet it was 8 years ago talking about this. And FreightWaves, it has made an investment into the carbon intelligence, that carbon tracking. It's something that you're going to have to really be aware, especially as a trucking company or as a shipper. Let's face it, it's coming.
Yeah, and you know what? We all need to really think and consider as we move forward in what we do, the environment, right? I mean, at some point, I'm not talking about tree hugging, but I am talking about being a little bit more considerate about the environment that we live in.
Yeah, we're going to go to a break. We'll be back in just a second. This is Driver Dave. This is Sir Rick. We'll be back to you in 60 seconds.